Sarah and Mark had been looking forward to this moment for months. After moving from a cramped apartment in the city, they finally settled into their dream house. A charming, albeit aging Victorian home on the outskirts of town. It wasn't perfect, but it was full of character, with grand ceilings, intricate moldings, and a winding staircase that felt like something out of a fairy tale. Sarah, excited and full of hope, believed this new chapter would be the fresh start they needed. Mark, on the other hand, was more skeptical. He liked the idea of a big house, but something about the place made him uneasy, although he would never admit it to Sarah. The house had an undeniable air of mystery. Its faded wallpaper, cracked windows, and creaky floors suggested it had witnessed generations come and go. The first night after moving in, they celebrated with takeout pizza in the living room, laughing at how they could never afford such a place in the city. But as the evening drew to a close and the last slice of pizza was eaten, the house grew silent, eerily silent. Sarah, ever the optimist, dismissed the discomfort, but Mark couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The first unsettling event occurred late that night. They were getting ready for bed when Sarah heard it. A faint sound, like whispering, barely audible over the creaks of the house settling. She frowned, turning off the lamp beside her. "Did you hear that?" she asked, sitting up in bed, her voice thick with curiosity and a little anxiety. Mark, already half asleep, muttered, "It's probably just the wind." He rolled over, pulling the blanket tighter around him, but Sarah wasn't so easily convinced. She listened again, the low murmurs more distinct now. The sound seemed to be coming from the walls, as if the house itself was whispering in some ancient, forgotten language. Her heart raced. The next few days were filled with little things. Scratching sounds from behind the walls, lights flickering unpredictably, and the feeling of being watched. It was easy to dismiss these as simple quirks of an old house. But Sarah couldn't ignore the increasing sense of dread. By the third night, the whispering was no longer subtle. It became louder, almost as if it were calling to her by name. "Sarah." The voice seemed to echo through her very soul, sending a chill down her spine. She shot up from the bed, her breath shallow and quick. Mark stirred beside her but didn't wake up. "Mark," she whispered urgently, shaking him gently. "Did you hear it? It's calling my name." Mark groaned, still half-dazed. "It's nothing, just your imagination." But Sarah couldn't let it go. The voice was there, insistent, almost desperate. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't her mind playing tricks. Something or someone was trying to make contact. The following night, Sarah decided to stay awake. She needed to know what it was. As the clock ticked past midnight, she lay motionless in bed, eyes wide open in the darkness, listening for any sign of the whispers. And then it came again. "Sarah, help me." The words were so clear now, as if they were right beside her. Her breath caught in her throat, and she sat up quickly, her pulse pounding in her ears. She reached out to shake Mark awake, but he didn't stir. His body was cold to the touch, unnervingly cold, like he wasn't breathing. Panic bubbled in her chest as she frantically tried to wake him, but it was as if he were in a deep, unnatural sleep. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed through the house, making the walls tremble. Sarah screamed, jumping out of bed and stumbling toward the door, her heart racing. She was terrified, more than she'd ever been in her life. She glanced at Mark again, who was still eerily motionless, and then her eyes moved toward the hallway. The whispering had grown louder, now accompanied by soft, dragging footsteps, as though something or someone was walking toward her from the shadows. The atmosphere in the house grew thicker, suffocating. Sarah couldn't explain why, but she felt the house itself was alive, like it was watching, waiting for something. She stumbled out of the bedroom, her mind a blur of fear and confusion. The hallway stretched out before her, long and dark, its end obscured by the darkness of the staircase. The air was cold and damp, like the house itself was breathing. She was halfway down the stairs when she heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind her. Turning around quickly, Her eyes locked onto a shadow at the foot of the staircase. It was tall and dark, moving slowly as though it was waiting for her to come closer. Sarah's blood ran cold, her body frozen in terror. The whispering had stopped, replaced by a silence so complete, it felt suffocating. "Sarah!" The voice called again, this time from the shadow at the bottom of the stairs. It was deep and hollow, as if it came from the very foundations of the house itself. "You belong here." Sarah's legs finally gave way, and she collapsed to the floor, heart racing in her chest. What was happening? Why was she the target of this entity? Was she meant to stay here? Was this house truly haunted? Or was she losing her mind? Suddenly, Mark's voice cut through the silence, groggy but alive. "Sarah, what's going on?" He was sitting up in bed, blinking in confusion, as if nothing had happened. The fear that had gripped her moments ago started to recede, replaced by disbelief. The house was silent again. Sarah slowly rose to her feet, staring at Mark, unsure of what was real. Had she imagined it all? She turned back toward the stairs. The shadow was gone. The whispering had stopped. But she knew one thing for certain. Something had changed in that house. It was no longer just a house. It was a place filled with a presence that watched, waited, and whispered in the dark. The camera pans slowly to the darkened hallway, the faintest echo of a whisper trailing off into the silence. Sarah's eyes dart around, uncertainty clouding her thoughts, her body still trembling. Whatever had happened, whatever had been trying to reach her, wasn't over yet. The house was alive, and it was calling to her. Michael had always been a solitary man, the kind who found comfort in quiet spaces and the soft hum of his thoughts. As a reclusive writer, he preferred the peace of isolation, believing that it fed his creativity. When he found the old house at the edge of a quiet, forgotten town, it seemed like the perfect escape. The rent was cheap, the house was large enough to allow him to work undisturbed, and it had the kind of charm that evoked the stories he loved to write. Worn wood floors, crooked windows, and ivy creeping up its stone walls. There was a sense of history in every creak of the house, and Michael felt that he could finally focus on his writing without distractions. The town was small, sleepy, with a single street that ran through it. People barely noticed him as he moved in, and Michael preferred it that way. The house, on the other hand, stood out. It was nestled in the midst of a dense forest, away from prying eyes and the noise of the world. The first few days were serene. Michael worked on his novel, walking through the trees when he needed a break, and exploring the house's many rooms. But there was something about the house that he couldn't shake, an odd stillness that felt out of place even in its quiet setting. The longer he stayed, the more he realized that something was off. Started small. At first, it was just the feeling that he wasn't alone. A cold draft in the hallway when the windows were shut tight. The faintest sound of footsteps, too soft to be sure of, but distinct enough to make the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. He attributed these to the house's age and the wind moving through the cracks in the walls. But then the shadows began to change. One evening, as Michael sat at his desk, typing furiously, a strange sensation washed over him. It wasn't just the usual feeling of being watched. This was different, deeper, more suffocating. He glanced up from his screen and noticed, at the corner of the room, a shadow that seemed to stretch unnaturally long, far beyond the reach of the dim light. The room was small, with only a single light source casting faint glows on the walls. Yet the shadow continued to grow, creeping across the floor toward him, thick and black like ink bleeding into the very air itself. At first, Michael thought it was a trick of the light, a passing car outside, or perhaps a shadow from the tree branches pressing against the window. But when he blinked, the shadow remained. It didn't shift or fade as he expected. Instead, it seemed to pulse, its edges flickering like something alive. A cold chill seeped into the room, causing Michael to shiver. He stood up slowly, his heart beating faster now, unsure whether he should confront this dark, unnatural presence. But then, as if it knew he was watching, the shadow jerked, and for the briefest moment, Michael could see it take shape. It wasn't just a dark mass. It was as though something was trying to crawl out of the corner of the room. His stomach churned, and a deep sense of dread washed over him. The air was thick now, suffocating. His breathing quickened, but before he could react, the shadow receded, melting back into the corner like smoke. The following night, Michael tried to ignore the odd occurrence, chalking it up to fatigue. But the next evening, the shadows returned. This time, they were more pronounced. They darted across the walls, moving too fast for him to track. Michael would turn his head to catch a glimpse of one, only to find that it had disappeared when he looked directly at it. It was as though the shadows were aware of his presence, toying with him, always just out of reach. Sleep began to elude him. Michael found himself unable to shake the feeling of being stalked. The shadows no longer waited for the cover of night. They seemed to be everywhere, following him from room to room, waiting for him to look away. One night, he woke up in the middle of a dream, a nightmare to be precise, and found himself standing in the kitchen, looking out the window at the forest beyond. He couldn't remember how he'd gotten there. He turned to go back to bed, only to find a shadow standing at the doorway, watching him. He froze, his mind racing, heart pounding. The shadow didn't move, didn't speak. It simply stood there, blacker than the darkness of the night itself, and stared at him with an intensity that made his skin crawl. For a moment, he thought it was just a figment of his sleep-deprived mind. But as his eyes adjusted to the dim light, he realized the shadow was different. It had shape, structure, almost as if it were a person, cloaked in the absence of light. He could feel its presence now, heavy and oppressive. Panic seized him. Michael took a step forward, his breath shallow. But as he did, the shadow moved, just an inch, but enough to make him hesitate. The sound of his own heartbeat was deafening in the silence of the room. He backed away slowly, retreating into the hallway, unable to take his eyes off the figure that followed him. The air felt colder now, and the house seemed to groan in response, the floorboards creaking beneath his feet. He turned and fled back to his room, slamming the door behind him, the terror flooding through him. He leaned against the door, gasping for breath, trying to calm himself, but the image of that shadow lingered in his mind. What was it? Why was it watching him? That night, sleep never came. The shadows were too persistent, too real. They crept under his door, slipping through the cracks, curling around him like serpents in the dark. When he finally managed to fall asleep in the early hours of the morning, he dreamed of the forest outside, of tall, crooked trees with twisting branches, and a figure, shrouded in shadow, standing beneath them, waiting. In the dream, the figure spoke. Its voice was low, a rasping whisper that slithered into his mind. "You can't leave. You are mine now." Michael awoke with a start, his body drenched in sweat. The sun had barely risen, but he knew something was terribly wrong. The shadows had become more than just dark shapes on the wall. They had become a presence. Something that knew him, something that had been watching him long before he ever arrived in this cursed house. He got up, rushing to the door, throwing it open with the intention of leaving. But as he stepped into the hallway, he froze. The shadows were waiting for him to take a step forward, to come closer. The figure was there again, just at the edge of the hallway, watching him with cold, empty eyes. Michael stood paralyzed, unable to move. He realized, with a chilling certainty, that there was no escaping the house. Whatever haunted this place was not going to let him go. Julia had always been fascinated by the supernatural. As a child, she devoured books on hauntings and ghost stories, often imagining what it would be like to experience a real haunting. As an adult, her fascination turned into a career. She became a well-known paranormal investigator, gaining a reputation for her ability to document even the most elusive entities. However, after a terrifying incident years ago, one that nearly cost her life, she had become more cautious. The experience had shaken her belief in the rational world, and she had since retreated into a more controlled, methodical approach to her investigations. But when the old mansion on the outskirts of town came onto her radar, she knew she had to investigate. This place had a reputation for being one of the most haunted locations in the country. The whispers of its dark past intrigued her. The mansion loomed in the distance, an imposing structure that seemed to reach toward the sky with its spires. It had been abandoned for decades, left to the mercy of time and decay. The property was surrounded by a dense, overgrown garden, with vines creeping up the walls like fingers grasping for something just beyond reach. As Julia stepped through the wrought iron gates, the heavy scent of old stone and mildew filled the air. The mansion seemed to absorb the light around it, casting long shadows that made the place feel even colder, as if the very atmosphere was haunted by the spirits of those who once lived there. The front door creaked open as Julia entered, the hinges groaning under the weight of years of neglect. The grand foyer was a sight to behold, though worn and tired. Chandeliers hung low from the ceiling, their crystal pendants shattered or missing. Dust covered every surface, and the air felt thick, oppressive, as though something had been waiting for her arrival for a long time. The faint sound of footsteps echoed through the halls, but Julia knew she was alone. At least she hoped she was. She set up her equipment in the large, empty living room, cameras, audio recorders, and motion detectors. Her eyes darted around the room, studying the details. The walls were adorned with faded portraits of long-dead ancestors, their eyes hauntingly lifelike. A heavy silence hung in the air, broken only by the occasional creak of the old floorboards beneath her feet. She felt the presence of someone watching her. A cold shiver ran down her spine, but she dismissed it. This was just another investigation, another mystery to unravel. As the night deepened, strange things began to happen. The temperature dropped sharply, the hairs on the back of her neck standing on end as a sudden chill filled the room. Her breath became visible in the air, despite the fact that the mansion had been relatively warm earlier. The camera feeds began to glitch, distorting the images, and the sound from the audio recorder picked up faint whispers. So faint that at first, Julia thought it might just be the wind or static. But then the whispers grew louder. "Get out!" The voice was soft but chilling, like a breath against her ear, though no one was standing behind her. Julia froze, her heart hammering in her chest. She had heard stories of voices in haunted places, but she had never experienced something so vivid. The voice was filled with rage, as though it had been trapped here for centuries, waiting for someone to hear its desperate cries. The whispers continued, growing in intensity. "Leave before it's too late." Julia's pulse quickened, but she stayed calm, reaching for her recorder. She asked, "Who's here? What do you want?" The temperature dropped further, and the lights flickered ominously. Then the atmosphere thickened. The air became dense, almost suffocating, as if the walls themselves were closing in. She could feel a weight pressing against her chest, the air so thick it felt like she was struggling to breathe. Suddenly, one of the portraits hanging on the wall shifted. Julia's eyes widened as the image of an older man, his face stern and cold, began to shift. His eyes seemed to follow her, moving just slightly, as though he were alive. Julia's breath caught in her throat, and she instinctively took a step back. She fumbled with the camera in her hands, her mind racing. There was something in this house, something angry and powerful, and it wasn't going to let her leave. Then, a cold gust of wind slammed the door behind her, making her jump. She whipped around to find the once-closed door wide open, revealing the dark hallway beyond. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, as if urging her to leave. Julia wasn't sure if it was the house itself, or something far more sinister, but she felt the unmistakable sense of danger. There was something here, something that wanted her gone. Without thinking, she grabbed her equipment and made her way toward the staircase. As she ascended, the sound of footsteps echoed from below, but they weren't her own. They were heavier, more deliberate. Julia's heart skipped a beat as she looked over her shoulder, but no one was there. The house seemed to come alive, the very walls pulsating with an unseen energy. At the top of the stairs, Julia noticed a door at the end of the hallway. It was slightly ajar, a dim light spilling out from within. She hesitated for only a moment before pushing the door open, revealing a room that looked as though time had stopped. The furniture was covered in sheets, but the eerie presence in the room was palpable. It felt wrong, as if she had stepped into a place where the air itself had been steeped in sorrow and anger. And then she saw it. A figure, tall and shrouded in shadow, stood in the far corner of the room, staring at her with cold, lifeless eyes. Julia's breath hitched in her chest as she took a step back, her instincts screaming at her to run. But she couldn't move. Her feet felt frozen in place, as if the very ground beneath her was holding her still. The figure's gaze seemed to pierce her soul, and in that instant, she knew it wasn't just a spirit. It was something far more malevolent. It wasn't content to haunt this mansion. It wanted to take her, to claim her as part of its dark history. The figure began to move toward her, its form shifting and contorting with every step. The whispers filled the room, louder now, almost deafening. "You should have left. You belong to me now." Panic gripped Julia, but her body refused to obey. She reached for her equipment, trying to force herself into action, but her hands trembled uncontrollably. The figure grew closer, its presence consuming the room, the temperature dropping so low she could see her breath fog in front of her. Just as the figure reached out toward her, its icy fingers brushing her skin, Julia finally snapped out of her trance. Her instincts kicked in, and with a surge of adrenaline, she bolted for the door. She could hear the sounds of pursuit, footsteps following her, breathing close behind her as though the entity was not content to let her leave so easily. As she sprinted down the hall, the house seemed to close in around her, the walls pressing in, the shadows growing longer. Julia didn't stop. She didn't look back. She had to get out. But the house wasn't done with her yet. Just before she reached the front door, the lights flickered one last time, and the figure appeared in the doorway, blocking her escape. Julia could hear the whispers in her ears now, louder than ever, urging her to give in, to become part of the house. She took one last, desperate step toward the door, and as her hand reached the handle, a cold, bone-chilling scream echoed through the halls. "You're not leaving?" With a final, frantic pull, she yanked the door open and ran into the night, her heart pounding in her chest. As she fled the mansion, she could still hear the whispers, still feel the presence of the spirit, as if it were following her. But she had escaped for now. The mansion, however, would never let her forget. Tom had always considered himself a practical man. He wasn't easily spooked, and he didn't believe in the supernatural. That was one of the reasons he had decided to move into the old house. It was affordable, quiet, and the perfect place to focus on his studies. The attic, though, always seemed to beckon to him in ways he couldn't explain. He had been living in the house for a month, and although it was certainly old and worn down, it had a kind of charm. The kind of place he could see himself settling into for the long haul. The house was a small, two-story building, nestled in a sleepy suburban neighborhood. From the outside, it looked like any other old home, shabby but not unwelcoming. The windows were cracked in places, and the lawn was overgrown, but nothing about the house screamed danger. Yet, as Tom explored it in the first few days, something in the back of his mind couldn't shake the feeling that there was something hidden in the house. A secret, perhaps, lurking just beneath the surface. It wasn't until he discovered the attic door that he began to feel a growing sense of unease. It was tucked away at the top of the stairs, hidden behind an old wooden cupboard, almost as if it didn't want to be found. The door itself was nothing special, just a simple, weathered piece of wood with a rusty handle. But when Tom first noticed it, he couldn't ignore the odd sense of tension that seemed to hang in the air. The space around it felt colder, heavier, as if the door itself held something from the past that was waiting to be uncovered. He tried to push the feeling aside, telling himself it was just the house's age getting to him, but every time he passed by it, he couldn't help but glance up at the door, wondering what lay beyond. One afternoon, as the sun dipped low behind the trees, casting long shadows across the room, Tom's curiosity got the better of him. He was tired of dismissing the door as a mere relic of an old house, and his practical nature urged him to find out what was really behind it. He grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen drawer and made his way up the stairs. His hand shook slightly as he gripped the handle, but he quickly dismissed it as nerves. When he turned the handle, the door creaked open slowly, a long, drawn-out sound that seemed to reverberate in the still air. The attic was dark, darker than he had anticipated. The beam of his flashlight barely cut through the dense shadows as he stepped inside. The air smelled stale, like it hadn't been disturbed in years, and the floorboards creaked beneath his weight as he walked deeper into the room. Dust hung in the air, swirling with each step, and cobwebs clung to the rafters. There was a sense of abandonment in the room, as if nothing had moved up there for decades. Tom scanned the room with the beam of his flashlight, his eyes narrowing as they fell upon an old trunk sitting against the far wall. It was an antique, its wood worn and faded from years of neglect. The trunk was sealed with a heavy brass lock, its surface scarred with scratches and dents, as though it had been thrown around in its lifetime. Tom couldn't explain why, but his heart began to race as he stared at the trunk. Something about it called to him, a subtle tug in the pit of his stomach, urging him to open it. As he moved toward the trunk, a strange feeling washed over him, a sudden sense of being watched. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up, and he whipped around, shining the flashlight into the corners of the room. The beam of light sliced through the darkness, but nothing was there. He shook his head, trying to laugh off the growing sense of dread. It was just the isolation, he told himself. He was alone in a large, old house, and the silence was getting to him. But then, just as he was about to kneel down to inspect the trunk, the temperature in the room dropped. Tom shivered, the air around him turning cold and thick. His breath fogged in the air, the chill creeping into his bones. He could hear the house settling around him, creaks and groans that seemed to come from every corner, but the silence in the attic felt suffocating now. His flashlight flickered, the beam dimming for a split second before coming back to life. Tom tried to shake off the uneasy feeling. He had to open the trunk. He had to see what was inside. So, with a deep breath, he crouched down, running his fingers over the lock. The metal was cold, its surface smooth but rough at the edges, as though it had been aged by time. The key, if there had ever been one, was long gone, but the lock looked weak. His fingers worked at it, twisting and pulling until, with a sharp click, it came undone. The lid creaked open with a sound that echoed in the empty attic. Tom's flashlight shook in his hand as the beam revealed the contents. At first, it seemed like just old clothes, worn, tattered garments piled on top of each other. But as Tom reached down, he noticed something strange. Beneath the clothes were old, yellowing papers, each one marked with what appeared to be strange symbols. His heart began to race again as he realized that some of the symbols were familiar, having seen them in old occult books. As he sifted through the papers, his fingers brushed against something cold. He recoiled slightly, his breath catching in his throat as he pulled out what appeared to be a small, wooden box, intricately carved with symbols similar to those on the papers. The box was old, its surface worn smooth by time. Something about it felt wrong, as though it didn't belong in this world. Tom's curiosity overwhelmed him, and despite the gnawing feeling of dread that seemed to grip his chest, he opened the box. Inside, he found what looked like a small, delicate figurine, a carved wooden doll with a twisted, grotesque face. The doll's eyes were hollow, and its mouth was twisted into a mocking grin. It felt heavier than it should have been, its wooden form cold to the touch. At that moment, the temperature in the room plummeted. Tom's breath became visible in the air, his pulse pounding in his ears as the shadows in the corners of the attic seemed to shift. He could hear something now, scratching, tapping, faint, but undeniable. The flashlight flickered once more, and then the beam cut out entirely, plunging him into complete darkness. In the pitch black, Tom's heart thundered in his chest. He stood frozen, unable to move, his hands trembling. The scratching noise grew louder, closer, as if something was approaching him in the dark. He tried to reach for his phone in his pocket, but his limbs felt heavy, as though something was holding him in place. Then, a voice, low, guttural, and ancient, whispered from the darkness. "You shouldn't have opened it." Tom's blood ran cold. He dropped the figurine, stumbling backward as the darkness seemed to close in around him. The air grew thick with the sound of something moving, something that wasn't human. The shadows in the attic began to take shape, figures, cloaked in black, emerging from the corners, slowly encroaching upon him. Panicked, Tom turned and bolted for the door, but it slammed shut with a deafening bang, trapping him inside. When Laura inherited the old family estate, she didn't expect it to come with a legacy of ghosts. The mansion had been in her family for generations, a grand building tucked away in the countryside, far from the hustle and bustle of modern life. Its history was as tangled as the ivy that clung to its stone walls, and Laura had always been fascinated by the tales her grandmother used to tell her. Stories of strange happenings, unexplained sounds, and whispers that echoed in the night. But, like most young adults, she brushed off these tales as mere superstition and family folklore, never truly believing that anything was amiss. It wasn't until she moved into the estate after her grandmother's passing that Laura began to feel the strange pull of the house. The first few days were spent organizing the old furniture, cleaning the rooms, and going through the many possessions left behind. Among the most striking pieces were the mirrors, massive, ornately framed, and hung in nearly every room of the house. They were beautiful, with intricate carvings of flowers and vines etched into their gold leaf frames. But there was something unsettling about them, something that made her stomach turn whenever she passed by one. The mirrors weren't just reflections. They seemed to have an almost sentient quality, as if they could see more than what was simply in front of them. Laura had tried to ignore the feeling that the mirrors were watching her, but it became impossible to shake the sensation that there was something off about them. Each time she glanced into one, she would catch the fleeting image of someone, or something, moving behind her. It was always quick, too quick to be sure of, but enough to make her feel like she wasn't alone. One night, after a long day of clearing out the attic, Laura found herself wandering the mansion, unable to sleep. She passed by the grand mirror in the hallway, its surface reflecting the dim glow of the hallway light. For a moment, she paused, her gaze lingering on the glass. The reflection of the hallway seemed normal, but in the corner of the mirror, there was a shadow, just a faint flicker. Laura frowned, blinking hard, trying to shake off the fatigue from her long day. But when she looked again, the shadow was still there. It wasn't just any shadow. It was the distinct shape of a person, standing perfectly still in the corner of the reflection. A woman, draped in an old-fashioned dress, her face obscured by long, dark hair that fell in tangled strands over her face. Her posture was rigid, almost unnatural, as though she had been standing there for years, waiting. Laura's heart skipped a beat, and she took a step closer to the mirror, her breath catching in her throat. The woman in the reflection didn't move. Her presence was cold, and the air around Laura seemed to drop several degrees, an icy chill creeping up her spine. She reached out hesitantly, her fingers grazing the cold glass. Felt wrong. The reflection seemed to shimmer for a brief second, and then the woman was gone, vanishing from the mirror like she had never been there. Confused, Laura pulled her hand back and took a deep breath. She looked around the hallway, but no one was there. The house was silent, its vast expanse echoing her every movement. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. The mirror, once a beautiful decoration, now seemed to pulse with a dark energy, as if it was aware of her presence. Over the following days, Laura became more and more aware of the strange occurrences that centered around the mirrors. In the early mornings, when she would pass by the hallway mirror, she could see the reflection of the staircase behind her. Despite the fact that no one had been up there, the staircase was empty, yet in the reflection, there was always a shadow, a fleeting figure that moved in and out of view. Laura convinced herself that it was just a trick of the light or a distortion caused by the old, warped glass. But deep down, she knew something was wrong. It wasn't until the third week of her stay that the real horror began. Laura had decided to spend the night in the old sitting room, reading a book by the fireplace. The flames cast flickering shadows on the walls, the only light in the room, and the night felt calm and peaceful. However, every now and then, She would glance up and notice that the mirrors in the room, large, ornate ones that framed the walls, reflected not the peaceful atmosphere, but something darker. At first, it was subtle. A movement in the reflection, a change in the lighting that didn't match the actual room. The mirrors seemed to warp, the figures in them shifting in unnatural ways. Laura tried to ignore it, chalking it up to her tired mind playing tricks, but it soon escalated. One evening, as she sat near the fire, the reflection in the mirror across from her began to change in a way that felt impossible. The flames in the hearth were reflected in the glass, but there was something else. A figure appeared in the mirror, tall, cloaked in shadow. It had no face, just a hollow, empty void where the head should have been. Its long, thin fingers reached out from the reflection, stretching impossibly long, as though they were moving beyond the glass itself. The figure's presence seemed to distort the air around it, as if the very room was bending to accommodate it. The temperature dropped sharply, and Laura's breath fogged in the air. Her heart raced as the figure moved closer, its fingers brushing the surface of the glass, leaving a trail of frost in their wake. Laura's hand shook as she reached for her phone, trying to capture a photo of the reflection. But the figure in the mirror vanished just as her camera flashed, leaving only the empty space behind her. She turned quickly, her eyes scanning the room, but there was nothing there. The mirrors were calm again, reflecting only the empty room. But Laura knew that what she had seen wasn't a trick. It wasn't just her imagination. Something in the mirrors had reached out to her, something dark and malevolent that existed beyond the glass. The mirrors were not merely reflecting reality. They were windows to something else, to a past she couldn't understand, and to a presence that would not let her leave. As the days passed, the mirrors became more active, more dangerous. She would wake in the middle of the night to find her reflection staring back at her from the mirror across the room, its expression twisted in a grotesque grin. The shadows in the mirrors seemed to have a life of their own, constantly shifting, growing, and disappearing. They became more violent, more insistent. They wanted her. One night, after a particularly terrifying experience where she saw her own reflection stand up in the mirror and move toward her, Laura decided she had had enough. She had to leave the mansion. She couldn't live with this terror anymore. But when she tried to leave, the mirrors wouldn't let her. Each time she passed a mirror, she could see the same woman, standing still in the corner of the glass, waiting for her. But this time, the woman's face was visible. Her eyes were black, hollow, and full of malice, and her mouth was twisted in an eerie, mocking smile. "You cannot leave," the woman's reflection whispered. Laura backed away, but the mirrors followed her. She could feel their pull, their oppressive weight dragging her back to them. No matter where she went, no matter how fast she ran, the mirrors seemed to trap her in their gaze, pulling her deeper into the mansion, into the darkness. The house, with its countless mirrors, wasn't just a prison. It was a place where past and present collided, where the reflections didn't just show the world, they controlled it. And now Laura was a part of that world, and there was no escape. Jake had always loved the quiet of his new home. It wasn't a grand house by any means, just a small, two-story building on the outskirts of a rural town, but it was the perfect escape from the city. The peace and solitude gave him the space he needed to focus on his work and relax after long days. The house itself was old, but well-kept, and Jake didn't mind that it was somewhat isolated. It felt like the kind of place where one could finally find peace. When he first moved in, Jake couldn't help but notice the odd, faint scratching sounds coming from within the walls. At first, he dismissed them as the usual creaks and groans that come with an aging house. However, as the days went by, the sounds grew louder, more distinct, and undeniably strange. It wasn't just the house settling. There was someone, moving inside the walls. Jake assumed it was rats or some other kind of animal, so he called in a pest control company. But they found nothing. No rats, no signs of any creatures, just an eerie silence behind the walls. Still, the scratching continued. It was always most prominent late at night, when Jake lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling. The sound was almost rhythmic, as though something was trying to break through the drywall. Every so often, it would stop for a moment, only to return with renewed intensity. The noise became impossible to ignore, gnawing at Jake's sanity. It was as though the house itself was alive, breathing, pulsating with something trapped within it. Then came the whispers. At first, Jake thought it was his imagination, his mind playing tricks on him due to the lack of sleep. He would wake up in the middle of the night to faint voices coming from the walls. The whispers were soft at first, barely audible, as if someone were standing just outside the room, speaking in hushed tones. He tried to ignore it, but the feeling of being watched began to settle over him like a heavy weight. It was always the same phrase, "Let me out." The whispering would send shivers down his spine, his heart racing as the cold, unfamiliar words echoed in his ears. There was something about the voice. It sounded desperate, pleading, and although it was faint, it seemed to come from all directions, surrounding him. Jake decided to investigate. Armed with a flashlight and his phone, he stood in the center of his living room, staring at the walls. The house was silent now, but the feeling of unease lingered. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to stretch unnaturally long, creeping toward him like tendrils of darkness. He ran his hands over the walls, feeling for any sign of movement, but they were solid, undisturbed. He was just about to give up when he felt something. A faint vibration beneath his palm, as though something were tapping on the wall from the other side. He froze, listening closely, but the noise didn't come again. He moved his hands slowly along the wall, stopping when he reached the area near the fireplace. The vibration was stronger here. His heart skipped a beat. The wall seemed too solid to be hollow, but there it was, a subtle pulse beneath his fingertips. Jake stepped back and stared at the wall, his mind racing. What was behind it? Who was behind it? And more importantly, why were they trying to get out? The scratching started again, this time louder, more frantic. It echoed through the house like a pounding heartbeat, and Jake could almost feel the pressure building behind the wall. Panic surged within him. He grabbed a crowbar from the shed outside and returned to the living room, his hands trembling. He didn't know what he was about to uncover, but he had to know. With a few strikes of the crowbar, Jake pried away the old drywall. As he pulled the pieces away, dust filled the air, and the smell of decay hit his nose, sharp and bitter. Behind the wall was an empty, narrow space. But there, in the corner just beneath the floorboards, was someone shackled to the wall. Jake stumbled back in shock, his flashlight trembling in his grip. The figure before him was hunched and ragged, a man covered in filth and dirt. His skin was pale, nearly translucent, his eyes wide and wild with fear. He looked as though he hadn't seen the light of day in years. His hair hung in matted clumps around his face, and his body was thin, skeletal even. His clothes were torn, barely hanging on his frail frame. He looked more like a ghost than a man. But it was the eyes that unnerved Jake the most. There was something deeply unsettling about them, something hollow and unblinking. The man's gaze locked onto Jake's, and for a moment, neither of them moved. Then the man opened his mouth, but instead of words, a deep, guttural sound escaped. A desperate plea. "Let me out." The voice was hoarse, like it had been used for years, and it reverberated in Jake's bones. His blood ran cold as he stared at the man, whose thin lips twisted into a horrific grin. The man's eyes darted toward the hole in the wall, then back to Jake, his body twitching, as though urging him to help. For a moment, Jake was frozen, unsure of what to do. But before he could react, the man's fingers scraped along the floor, a loud, scraping sound that filled the room. He pulled his hands away from the wall and began to move toward Jake, dragging himself along the floor. The closer he came, the more the air around Jake seemed to grow heavy, suffocating. The man's voice returned, this time even more frantic, almost pleading. "Please, help me. Let me out." Jake's heart pounded in his chest as the man continued to inch closer. There was something about the way he moved, something unnatural, as though he wasn't quite human. Jake tried to back away, but his legs felt like they were made of stone. He couldn't tear his eyes away from the man's desperate expression. Suddenly, the man lunged forward, his body jerking in a violent, spasming motion. Jake stumbled backward in horror, but the figure was faster. His cold, clammy hand grabbed Jake's ankle, sending a jolt of ice through his body. He screamed in panic, but the man's grip tightened, pulling him closer to the wall, dragging him into the darkness. "Let me out!" The man's voice echoed in Jake's ears, louder, more insistent. Jake kicked and struggled, but the man's grip was unyielding, and the darkness of the hole seemed to swallow him whole. His flashlight rolled across the floor, casting long, flickering shadows as the walls closed in, the man's cold breath on his skin. And then, everything went silent. The house, once filled with the noises of scratching and whispers, was now completely still. The only sound was Jake's own ragged breathing. When the morning came, the room was empty. The man was gone, the hole in the wall sealed as if it had never been disturbed. Jake was nowhere to be found. The house stood silent, its walls hiding yet another dark secret. But the scratching was still there, still faintly echoing in the distance. Claire had always been a skeptic. She grew up in a house filled with stories about haunted places, ghostly encounters, and the paranormal. Her father was a practical man, always dismissing any talk of spirits as fantasy, while her mother entertained such notions with a mixture of fear and curiosity. But Claire, being the youngest of 3 children, simply didn't believe in things that couldn't be proven with science. As she got older, she became a writer, often finding herself investigating the eerie and unexplained in her work, but always with a mind rooted in logic. That was, until she moved into the old farmhouse on the edge of town. The house had been vacant for years, ever since the previous owners had mysteriously disappeared. No one knew why they left, only that the house had been abandoned in the middle of the night. Despite its spooky reputation, Claire was drawn to it, intrigued by its potential and the mystery surrounding it. It wasn't a large house, just a 2-story building with a large basement and a sprawling yard. When Claire bought it, she thought it was the perfect project, a place where she could escape the chaos of city life. The house had its quirks: creaky floorboards, drafty windows, and strange little sounds at night, but Claire didn't mind. She'd grown up in an old house with similar issues. What bothered her, however, were the recurring noises from the basement. At first, it started out as small sounds, whispers and soft thumps, nothing too alarming. But over time, they grew more frequent and more distinct. The whispers sounded like children's voices, and the thumps seemed like footsteps, followed by an eerie silence. Sometimes, Claire would find strange marks on the basement door, like handprints smeared in dirt, and yet there were no children living with her. She tried to convince herself that it was just the house settling, the old wood creaking and groaning in the night. But the more she heard, the less certain she became. One night, after hearing the noises for the 100th time, Claire finally decided to investigate. She grabbed a flashlight and descended into the basement. The stairs creaked under her weight, and the air grew colder as she reached the bottom. The basement was dark, lit only by the weak beam of her flashlight. The space was musty, filled with boxes of old furniture and forgotten items, but it was otherwise empty. Claire walked slowly, the sound of her footsteps echoing off the concrete walls. As she reached the center of the room, she felt a sudden chill run down her spine. The whispers were louder now, and she could swear she heard children's laughter. "Hello," Claire called out, trying to keep her voice steady. "Is someone down here?" No answer. The basement was completely still, save for the occasional creak of the house settling. She was about to turn and leave when something caught her eye. A shadow, fleeting and fast, darting across the far corner of the room. Claire froze, her heart racing as her flashlight swept across the area where she saw the movement. There was nothing there. She took a step forward and then another. But as she moved deeper into the basement, the air grew thick and oppressive, like a weight pressing down on her chest. The laughter grew louder, but it was now distorted, twisted, as though something was mocking her. Her breath became shallow, and her pulse quickened. "Is someone here?" she called again, this time with more urgency. From the corner of her eye, she saw it, 3 small figures standing in the shadows near the far wall. They were children, dressed in old-fashioned clothing, their faces hidden in the darkness. They were motionless, staring at her with unblinking eyes. Claire's heart skipped a beat. The children didn't move, but their presence was overwhelming. She felt a rush of cold air sweep past her, and the whispers grew louder, voices, not just from the children, but from something else, something older, something far more malevolent. Go away. One of the children's voices whispered, barely audible. You shouldn't be here. Claire stepped back, her flashlight shaking in her hand. Samantha never believed in ghosts. She'd always seen herself as a rational, logical person, one who trusted science over superstition. That's why, when she inherited the old family estate from her late aunt, she was more focused on restoring the place than worrying about any ghost stories. The house was beautiful, an old colonial-style manor with sweeping gardens, towering oak trees, and ivy-covered stone walls. It had been in her family for generations, though no one had lived there in years. Still, she'd always loved visiting as a child, until her aunt's passing. The first few days in the house were filled with excitement. Samantha spent her time cleaning out the attic, sorting through old furniture, and unpacking the boxes she had brought from her apartment. She was eager to breathe new life into the place and make it her own. But there was one thing she couldn't ignore: the gardens. The house sat on acres of land, and the garden, once a beautiful oasis, was now overrun with weeds, thorns, and tangled vines. Samantha had always been fond of gardening and figured she would start with the overgrown grounds. The first morning after settling in, she ventured outside to survey the mess. The sun was just rising, casting long, soft shadows over the garden. As she stepped outside, she felt the cool morning air brush against her skin and the faint scent of damp earth and flowers. At first, everything seemed peaceful, too peaceful. The garden, despite its wildness, had a certain charm to it. The thick vines that crawled up the stone walls of the manor, the wildflowers that dotted the landscape, and the giant oak tree in the middle of it all made it seem like something out of a fairy tale. But there was a certain heaviness to the atmosphere, a lingering presence that Samantha couldn't shake. It was as though the garden was watching her. On the second day of working in the garden, Samantha decided to clear out the overgrown paths that led to a small, hidden greenhouse in the back. It was a place she remembered from her childhood, dark, mysterious, and full of strange plants her aunt had once cultivated. The greenhouse had always been a place of fascination, but now it looked forgotten, abandoned. As she cleared the brush and weeds near the door, Samantha noticed something strange. Footprints. They weren't hers. The prints were fresh, and they led toward the greenhouse. Her heart skipped a beat. She thought about her aunt's passing and how the house had been empty for months before her arrival. No one had been there, so who else was? Her curiosity piqued. Samantha followed the trail of footprints to the old greenhouse. The door creaked as she pushed it open, the hinges long rusted and stiff. The smell inside was musty, thick with the scent of damp wood and soil. As her flashlight beam swept over the room, she saw it. The garden tools still neatly arranged in their corners, and the odd assortment of strange plants that her aunt had once cared for. But there, in the far corner of the room, was something that made Samantha's blood run cold. A figure. It was an old man, hunched over, his back to her as he tended to the plants. He wore a weathered straw hat, his hands moving with a slow, deliberate motion as he worked the soil. Samantha froze, her breath caught in her throat. She hadn't seen anyone arrive, and yet here he was, in the greenhouse, seemingly oblivious to her presence. "Excuse me?" Samantha's voice was shaky, barely above a whisper. "Who are you?" The man didn't respond. She took a hesitant step forward, the gravel crunching under her feet. "Hello?" she said again, her voice louder this time. Still, he didn't answer. It was as if he didn't hear her at all. Samantha's pulse raced as she stepped closer. The air felt colder now, heavy with an unnatural stillness. The man's movements were jerky, stiff, and unnervingly slow. As she got within a few feet of him, she noticed that his skin was pale, almost ashen, and his hands were covered in deep, dark stains. "Are you okay?" she asked, a sense of dread beginning to seep into her words. "Can I help you?" It was then that the man turned slowly, his head tilting to the side in a way that felt wrong. Eliza had always been drawn to antique stores. There was something about the old, weathered items, furniture, clocks, portraits, that intrigued her. It wasn't just the nostalgia they carried, but the sense that they held secrets. Each item seemed to tell a story of a different time, a different life. So, when she stumbled across an old Victorian-style mirror at a small, dimly lit shop in the corner of town, she couldn't resist. It was beautiful, large, with a dark mahogany frame, carved with intricate patterns of roses and vines. Despite its age, it was in perfect condition, the glass gleaming as if it had never been touched by time. The shopkeeper, an elderly man with a knowing smile, warned Eliza to be cautious. "Old things like that, miss, sometimes they carry more than just memories," he said cryptically, his eyes twinkling with an unsettling glint. But Eliza, dismissing it as nothing more than the ramblings of an eccentric, bought the mirror without a second thought. She had always been the practical type, after all, and believed in nothing supernatural. At first, everything seemed normal. She placed the mirror in her hallway, where the light from the windows reflected off its polished surface. It became a focal point of her home, admired by friends who visited. But over time, something strange began to happen. It wasn't immediate, but as the days turned into weeks, Eliza started noticing small, subtle changes. Every time she passed the mirror, she felt a fleeting sensation, like someone was standing just behind her. When she glanced into the reflection, she'd see nothing but her own image, but there was a feeling of presence, as though something was watching her. At first, it was easy to dismiss as paranoia, but the feeling intensified. It became harder to ignore. One evening, as Eliza stood in front of the mirror, adjusting her coat before leaving for a party, she caught a glimpse of something strange out of the corner of her eye. A shadow, just beside her own reflection. It was faint, almost indistinguishable from the darkening room, but there it was. She spun around quickly, but there was nothing behind her. When she looked back at the mirror, she could see only her reflection, clear and undisturbed. She shook her head, trying to brush it off, but the unease lingered. Over the next few days, the odd occurrences became more frequent. The shadow in the mirror began to grow darker, more defined. Eliza would walk past it and catch the feeling that someone was standing just behind her, but when she turned around, the hallway was always empty. Then, one night, after a particularly long day at work, Eliza sat down on her couch, exhausted, and gazed at the mirror from across the room. She noticed that the reflection of the hallway seemed different somehow, darker, colder, as though the light didn't reach as far. It wasn't until she got up to investigate that she saw it. The figure, a woman, standing in the reflection, her face obscured by long, tangled hair. Eliza froze, her heart skipping a beat. She could see the figure clearly now, dressed in an old-fashioned, tattered gown, her body swaying slightly as though moved by an unseen force. Michael had always loved art, especially portraits. There was something captivating about the way an artist could capture a person's soul, their very essence, in a painting. It wasn't just about the skill, it was the emotion, the history that lay beneath the brushstrokes. He often spent his free time browsing through art galleries, appreciating the masterpieces that had survived centuries. So when he stumbled upon an old portrait at a local estate sale, he couldn't resist. It was a striking piece, an oil painting of a woman dressed in Victorian clothing, her eyes dark and intense, staring directly at the viewer. The colors were muted but rich, with deep shades of burgundy and gold that gave the painting an almost lifelike quality. The woman's face was beautiful, yet there was an unsettling quality about her, something about her gaze that made Michael pause. It wasn't just a portrait. It felt like the woman was alive, like she was watching him, studying him with a knowledge that seemed too intimate. Despite the unease he felt, Michael was intrigued. He knew this painting was special, that it was worth something, both artistically and historically. He bought it on the spot, eager to add it to his collection. He planned to hang it in his study, where he could admire it every day. The frame was antique, made of carved wood that had darkened with age, adding to the painting's mysterious allure. When he hung the portrait in his study, the room seemed to change. The atmosphere shifted. It was subtle at first, like a change in the air pressure, but it was undeniable. The room became colder, and the light in the study seemed dimmer, even when the windows were open to let in the sunlight. Michael attributed it to the age of the house. Old houses had a way of changing with the seasons, after all. But the more time he spent in the room, the more he began to feel a presence, as if he were being watched. It wasn't just the painting. He began to hear soft sounds in the study when he was alone, whispers almost inaudible, like voices carried on the wind. Sometimes, when he would sit at his desk, the hairs on the back of his neck would stand up as though someone were standing just behind him. He would glance over his shoulder, but the room was always empty. The feeling of being watched grew stronger with each passing day, and it wasn't long before Michael realized it was the painting. One evening, as he sat reading a book in his study, the whispers became more distinct. At first, he couldn't understand the words, but they grew louder, more insistent. His eyes kept drifting to the portrait. The woman's gaze seemed sharper, more focused, as if she were staring directly at him, beckoning him with her eyes. It wasn't just that she was looking at him, it was the way her expression shifted. Her lips, which had once been painted into a serene smile, were now curled into a subtle, almost imperceptible grin. Michael's heart raced. Something was wrong. The temperature in the room dropped sharply, and he could see his breath fogging in the air. He stood up, his mind racing, his hands shaking. He moved toward the painting, his eyes locked on the woman's gaze. As he got closer, the air around him grew heavier, colder. He felt an oppressive weight, as though the room itself was closing in on him. Without warning, the whispers became a voice, low, haunting, and unmistakable. "You shouldn't have brought me here," the voice said, its tone thick with sorrow and malice. "I have been waiting for you." Michael froze, unable to move. His heart pounded in his chest, his limbs frozen in place. He could feel the presence of the woman in the painting, as though she were no longer confined to the canvas. It was as if she were stepping out of the frame, her figure becoming more solid, more real with each passing second. Her eyes, dark and endless, bore into his soul. The whispering grew louder, more urgent. "You cannot escape," the voice continued, now filling the room, reverberating off the walls. "You belong to me now." With a sudden burst of fear, Michael turned and ran for the door, his breath coming in ragged gasps. But the door wouldn't open. It was as if the air itself had thickened, trapping him inside.